They said she didn't belong there. They said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. And the man who said it was 24 years old, standing in a rented blazer with a radio clipped to his hip and an idea about authority that he had never once been asked to earn. He looked at a woman in a navy dress, walking up marble steps, and before she had spoken a single word, before she had reached for the invitation that was already in her bag, he made a decision. He stepped in front of her. And he said, "Ma'am, this event is for guests only. You need to leave." Now, in the room, 300 people in black tie and diamond earrings and pressed tuxedos, and the particular warm glow of people who have come to be seen doing good, watched, every single one of them. They turned their heads toward the top of those marble steps, and they watched, and not one person said stop. Not one person stepped forward. Not one person said wait. Not one person looked at the invitation the woman was already pulling from her bag and said, "Read it first." They watched, and they looked away, and they went back to their conversations and their champagne, and the woman in the navy dress was left standing on the steps in the November cold, like a problem that had been neatly relocated. But here is what that room did not know, what the man in the blazer did not know, what almost no one inside that gleaming ballroom, with its chandeliers and its ivory roses and its open bar and its comfortable feeling of righteous generosity, had any idea about at all. The woman standing on those steps had commanded 10,000 soldiers. By the end of that night, a 4-star general, a man with 34 years of decorated service, a man who had led operations on 4 continents and buried good soldiers and sent letters to their mothers and carried that weight for decades, without letting it change the quality of his character, would rise from his seat at the head table. He would reach up with both hands, deliberately, unhurried, and remove his service hat. He would hold it against his chest, not for a senator, not for a billionaire, not for a donor or a dignitary or anyone who had purchased their way into that room. For her. For the woman who had been told to leave the steps. She didn't know any of that yet. She was standing on the sidewalk in the November cold, coat over one arm, phone in one hand, invitation still in the other, making the next necessary call. Because that is what she did. That is what 22 years in service had made of her. You do not collapse in the face of an outrage. You do not perform your anger for an audience. You assess, and you act, and you do not let the noise of the moment make the decisions that the mission requires. She had learned that lesson in the desert. She had learned it under fire, figuratively and not. She had learned it in the 141 mornings. She woke up responsible for other people's lives and had to choose before she put her boots on to be the person who did not break. Subscribe and tell me where you're listening from in the comments, because this story needs to be heard all the way to the end. Now rewind. 6 hours earlier. Her name was Claudette Marianosi. She was 53 old. She had been born in the 3rd-floor apartment of a narrow brick house on Clement Street, the second of 4 daughters, to a father who drove a city bus for 27 years and came home every evening, smelling of engine oil and the specific exhaustion of public service, and a mother who worked the early shift at a hospital laundry 6 days a week and came home smelling of steam and industrial detergent, and who still, somehow, made dinner from scratch on 5 of those 6 days. Claudette grew up understanding at a cellular level before she had the language for it, the arithmetic of a family that did not have extra. Not struggling, exactly. Her parents were not people who struggled in the way that word implies defeat. They were people who were precise. Every dollar had a destination. Every hour had a purpose. Waste was not a moral failing in their house. It was simply impractical, and impractical things were the enemy of the possible, and the possible was what they believed in, with the full weight of two people who had come from less and built more and intended their daughters to build more still. Claudette had been a serious child, not solemn. There is a meaningful difference. Solemn children are performing gravity for an audience. Serious children are doing work. Claudette was doing work from the time she was 8 years old. She read everything the school library had, and then she read her father's newspapers and her mother's magazines and her older sister, Patricia's textbooks, before Patricia had finished them. She organized everything. When her mother needed to sort the household bills, Claudette built a system. Envelopes labeled by due date, a running total on a notepad on the refrigerator. When her father needed the fastest route to the hospital the night her mother went in for her appendix surgery, Claudette was 12 years old, and she produced a hand-drawn map with bus routes in red ink and transfer points in blue and estimated travel times written in small, neat numerals at each stage. Her father folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He wore it against his heart all day. He told her, when he got home that night, that it was the clearest map he had ever seen. She said, "I checked it twice." He said, "I know, that's why I trusted it." She was commissioned at 22 through OTC, through 4 years of discipline that looked effortless to anyone who had not seen the 6 o'clock mornings, and the extra study hours, and the refusal to cut any corner that had a bearing on quality. She understood, before she had words for it, that the most important formation happens before the audience arrives. The real work is the private work. The early mornings when no one is watching. The red pen corrections on a draft that no one has asked to see yet. The map drawn the night before, folded and carried in a shirt pocket, trusted because it had been checked twice. She served for 22 years. She was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and she retired as a full colonel. And between those 2 points, she served in 3 theaters of operation, commanded at the company level and the battalion level and the brigade level, oversaw the logistics and support operations for 10,000 soldiers during 41 months, as commander of the 44th Support Brigade, and received the Defense's Meritorious Service Medal, the Army Commendation Medal with three oak leaf clusters, and the Legion of Merit. She received the Legion of Merit at a ceremony in a large formal room full of people who knew exactly what the medal meant and what it cost to earn. The citation read in part, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services and achievements." She stood at attention while the pin was placed, and she did not let her face do anything except what it was supposed to do. Afterward, her sister Gloria found her in the parking lot and wrapped her arms around her and said, "You looked like you were trying not to cry in there." Claudette said, "I was trying not to cry." Gloria said, "Why, though?" Claudette said, "Because it wasn't only mine. The work never is." Gloria stepped back and looked at her and said, "That is exactly why you deserved it." She retired 3 years before the night of the gala. She came back to the city she had grown up in. The city she had left at 22 and returned to at 50, which is a particular kind of homecoming that does not feel like arrival so much as it feels like reacquaintance. And she moved into a clean apartment on the fourth floor of a building, 2 blocks from the house where she had grown up, in a neighborhood that had changed and stayed the same in equal and complicated measure. She set up the desk in the second bedroom. She arranged the 3 framed photographs in the hallway. Her graduation photograph, a photograph of herself as a young soldier in front of a desert vehicle, and the center photograph, the largest, of herself in full dress uniform at a podium in a room that was very clearly not a small room. The expression on her face in that photograph was not pride and was not performance. It was the expression of someone who has done the thing and no longer needs to prove it. She put her medals in the flat velvet box in the top drawer of the dresser. She put the velvet box next to a folded letter and a challenge coin from a commander who had been killed in action 6 years earlier. His name was Reginald Boateng. He had been her first battalion commander, a man who led quietly and completely, who had told her once, at the end of a week that had produced 2 casualties, and a failed mission, and a debrief in which blame was being distributed in ways that were not accurate, that the measure of a leader was not what they did when the mission was clear and the conditions were favorable. It was what they did when the mission was gone, and there was nothing left to carry them forward, except character. She had thought about that on many mornings since he said it. She thought about it. On the morning of the gala, she touched the challenge coin before she closed the drawer. Then she got dressed. She taught writing at the Hargrove Community Singing Center on Tuesdays and Thursdays in a classroom on the second floor, with windows that rattled in cold weather and fluorescent lights that buzzed at the frequency of low-grade anxiety. The students were adults, working people, men and women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who arrived in the evenings after full days on their feet, in warehouses and hospitals and stock sites and service jobs, and sat down in plastic chairs and picked up pens and tried to learn how to say what they meant. She loved them with the love that is not soft but is precise, the love of someone who sees clearly what another person is capable of and refuses to let them produce less than that. She was demanding. She circled vague language. She wrote margin notes that were not encouragements so much as invitations. Not you did well, but here is the thing you are not saying yet. Go say it. Several of her students had told her, at various points, that her class had changed something. She accepted this the way she accepted most things, directly, briefly, without performance, with a follow-up question about the work. On the Saturday morning of the gala, she was at the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside her elbow, and a stack of 9 essays in front of her. The window over the sink showed a November sky the color of old pewter, thin and taut and holding something. Not quite snow, but the idea of snow, the intention of it, the cold that precedes it by hours and settles into the light before the first flake falls. The radiator in the corner knocked twice and went quiet. Outside, she could hear the neighborhood's Saturday sounds. The early delivery truck 2 streets over, the dog that lived upstairs, the particular register of someone's television through a shared wall, a child's voice briefly and gone. Small sounds, familiar sounds, the sounds of a life that has settled around you like a room you have lived in, long enough to stop noticing. She worked through the essays one at a time. She had assigned them a hard prompt on purpose 2 weeks earlier, right about the moment you realized the story you had been telling about yourself was wrong. It was a hard prompt because it required honesty about the self, and honesty about the self is the thing that most people are trained by years of managed presentation to avoid. Several of the essays had tried to answer a different question, an easier one, a more flattering one, while appearing to answer the hard one. She circled those passages, she wrote. You're clearing your throat here. The essay starts after this. Find where you start telling the truth and begin there. The eighth essay was Deshawn's. He was 29 years old, and he worked overnight shifts at a distribution warehouse on the south side, and he came to class on Tuesdays, straight from his shift, jacket still zipped, coffee in hand, eyes carrying the soft blur of someone running on the far end of a long night. He never missed class. He asked specific questions. His drafts were long and tangled in the early passages, and then suddenly, somewhere in the middle, the real thing would appear. A sentence or a phrase, or sometimes just a clause, inside a longer sentence, that was true in the way that good writing is true, clean, specific, unavoidable. This draft was the same. 4 long paragraphs about his grandmother and the neighborhood and the version of himself he thought he was supposed to be. All of it useful background, all of it honest in its way, but none of it the essay. And then, buried in the middle of the 5th paragraph, in a subordinate clause inside a long and winding sentence, a single line that stopped her cold. She read it twice. She drew a box around it in red ink. She wrote in the margin, "This is the line. This is the whole essay. Everything before this paragraph is you clearing your throat. Start here, don't bury what is true." She set the pen down. She looked out the window. The sky was the same iron gray it had been all morning. A pigeon landed on the fire escape and stood there for a moment, regarding the world, and then departed. She looked at Deshawn's essay again, at the red box around the one true sentence, and she thought, he knows, it's there. He buried it because he knows. People bury the truest things because the truest things are the most exposed. Her job. The job she had given herself in this second life, after the service, in the community center on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, was to go in with a red pen and find the buried thing and hold it up in the light until the writer could not pretend they hadn't seen it. She finished the last essay, stacked them, put them in her bag. She made more coffee. She sat in the quiet kitchen and drank it while it was still hot. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier in an envelope with the Alderton Foundation letterhead embossed on the upper left. The Alderton Foundation Gala was the largest charitable fundraiser in the city, 14 years running. It raised money for veteran education and reintegration programs. Real programs with staff and structure and track records and waiting lists, not the kind of programs that exist primarily on a brochure. She had visited 2 of the sites herself in the past year. In the quiet way she did most things, without calling ahead for a formal tour, just showing up and asking to speak with whoever ran the day-to-day. She had sat with program directors in small offices and asked specific questions and listened carefully to specific answers and come away believing that the money was doing the thing money was supposed to do. Building scaffolding for people who had given years of their lives to an institution and then been released from it, often abruptly, often without transition, often into a silence where the mission used to be. The invitation was printed on heavy cream card stock. Her name was on the front. Inside, in addition to the formal printed details, there was a handwritten note at the bottom of the card in blue ballpoint ink. It said, "We would be deeply honored by your presence and by brief remarks, 10 minutes, on what the work of reintegration looks like from the inside." It was signed by Helen Park, the Foundation's executive director. She had almost not responded. She had a practice of declining invitations that asked her to be present rather than useful, events that wanted her credentials as decoration, rather than her knowledge as contribution. She had declined 4 such invitations in the past 2 years. She had no patience for the transaction in which a decorated veteran was placed on a stage so that a room could feel that it had done something, and the veteran's actual knowledge went untouched and unused. She was not a symbol. She was a person who knew specific things about a specific problem, and if an organization wanted that in the room, they could treat it as such. But she had seen the programs. She had sat in those small offices and heard the specific answers. She wrote back and said yes. She lay out the navy dress that afternoon. Floor length, simply cut, dark blue, good fabric, no embellishment. She had worn it once before, to her sister Gloria's retirement ceremony in Atlanta 18 months ago. She stood at the bathroom mirror and looked at herself in it with the practical attention she gave most things, checking that it was ready, that it communicated what it was supposed to communicate, which was not lavishness and not effort and not apology, but simply, "I am here." She put on her earrings, small and gold, the pair her mother had given her the week of her commissioning, 31 years ago, because her mother had known before anyone said so that Claudette was going to be an officer, and that an officer needed gold earrings for the ceremonies, and she had saved for them for 3 months. She did not bring her medals. The medals were in the velvet box in the dresser drawer, and they were going to stay there. This was not humility in the self-deprecating sense. It was a conviction she held with some firmness. A person who requires visible credentials in order to be treated with respect has already conceded something important. Your worth is not the ribbon. Your worth is the 22 years and the 10,000 soldiers and the letters to the mothers of the ones who did not come home. The ribbon is a receipt. You do not carry your receipt into every room. Either the room can see what it is looking at or it cannot. If it cannot, the correction required is not in what you wear. The correction required is in the room. She took her coat from the closet. She put her invitation in her small black bag. She turned off the kitchen light. She went downstairs and got into the car that had arrived at 7:15. The driver's name was Marcus. He had a photograph of 2 boys in baseball caps on the dashboard, and a small Pine air freshener hanging from the mirror, and the particular easy competence of someone who has driven the same city streets for many years and knows them the way musicians Z. Not consciously, but in the hands. He asked her if she was going to the gala. She said yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said his brother had been through a veteran reintegration program 2 years ago. He said it had given his brother back his life. He said it carefully, like a man who does not usually say this kind of thing out loud to strangers, but has decided tonight that he will. She asked his brother's name. He said Terence. She said she was glad Terence was doing well, and she meant it in the specific way. She meant the things that mattered, not as a pleasantry, but as a fact. The Alderton Hotel was 12 stories of stone and glass on the corner of Meridian and 4th, a building that had been erected in 1924 and renovated twice since, and wore all three eras in its face, in ways that were either charming or incongruous, depending on where you stood and how you felt about things that outlast their original purpose. The entrance was flanked by 3 flags and lit from below with warm amber light that turned the stone a color like old honey in the dark. A red carpet ran from the car drop-off to the front entrance. Velvet ropes. Staff in uniform on both sides. Photographers clustered near the tall glass doors of the grand ballroom entrance, their lenses pointed at whoever came through. Inside, through the glass, the light of chandeliers moved over a room, already populated with formal wear, already generating the particular collective warmth of 300 people, gathered in a space smaller than their ambition, glittering under lights designed to make everything look like the best version of itself. She came up the steps alone. Travis Pelham had been a security guard at the Alderton Hotel for 11 months. Before that, he had worked the door at 2 nightclubs and a corporate parking structure. He was 24 years old, and he was not, at his foundation, a bad person. This is important to say, and it is important not to use it as an excuse, because it is both true and insufficient. He was not malicious. He was not acting from hate in any conscious sense. He was a person who had been given a position, a uniform, a policy binder, and a radio, and who had, in the absence of any real examinations of how assumptions work, mistaken the position for judgment. He had read the policy binder twice. He understood his role as keep the event secure, verify the guests, no exceptions. He had taken these instructions and organized them into a system in which his first impression was the verification. And the invitation was, at best, supporting documentation for a conclusion already reached. He saw Claudette Osei at the top of the steps, and the calculation happened. It was not thought. Precisely, thought has architecture, has steps, has the possibility of revision. What happened in Travis Pelham in those 2 seconds before he moved was faster than thought and older than thought, and had nothing to do with the woman in front of him and everything to do with the things he had never been asked to examine. He saw a black woman, alone, in a dress that had no visible jewelry of weight, carrying her own coat. He did not see the 22 years. He did not see the 10,000 soldiers. He did not see the velvet box she had left in the drawer. He did not ask. He moved to block the door. "Ma'am, this is a private event." Claudette stopped walking. She looked at him with the full, direct attention of someone who knows exactly what is happening. "Yes," she said, "I know. Guests need to present their invitations at the door. Of course." She opened her bag, and she found the envelope. The cream Alderton Foundation stock, her name printed on the outside in formal type, the handwritten note visible through the open flap. And she held it out. He did not take it. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have already decided not to credit. His eyes moved across the envelope without landing. "This event is for registered guests," he said. "Are you on the list?" she said. "My name is Claudette Osey. I am on the program this evening. I am giving remarks." His head tilted, that small familiar tilt that is not a question and is not a challenge but is a verdict dressed as skepticism. It said, "I don't think so." It said, "I have already decided, and what you are telling me is an inconvenience. I'm going to need to ask you to step aside while I verify that," he said. "Of course." She stepped aside. She stood on those steps for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. She counted them the way she had always counted things that mattered. Not anxiously, not performatively, but with the practical attention of a person who knows that duration is data, and that data is useful, and that the time spent waiting on steps is as much a fact of an evening as anything else that happens. She stood straight. She held her coat over one arm, and the cream envelope in her other hand, her name visible on it, available to anyone who came close enough to read 5 words. She watched the door. She watched the people moving past her through it in a steady, uninterrupted stream. The couples, the clusters, the individuals in their black tie and their formal gowns. All of them received without question. All of them welcomed through. None of them pausing. None of them experiencing the particular quality of attention that she was experiencing, which is the attention of a person who has been set aside to be decided about. One woman in a silver gown glanced at her as she passed. The glance was 2 seconds. It took in Claudette and registered something, and then moved away back to the room and the evening and the rest of the night. She did not slow her step. One man, older, dark suit, a small gold pin on his lapel from a veterans organization that Claudette recognized as from across the distance, slowed his step when he saw her standing there. He looked at her. He looked at Travis. He looked back at her. Something happened on his face that was not uncomplex. Recognition, discomfort, the beginning of something that might be a decision. He stood there for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he went inside. That 3-second calculations, that choice made in the gap between recognition and action, would sit in him in the days that followed like a stone, in still water, settling deeper as the water cleared. Near the side entrance, a young woman came through with a tray of empty champagne flutes balanced on one palm, moving toward the kitchen. Her name was Amara. She was 19 years old, and she was booking this event for the tuition money because the spring semester balance was due in 3 weeks, and she was $460 short. She saw the woman standing on the steps from 20 feet away, and she stopped moving for a moment. Not a long moment, just a single second. And something happened in her that was immediate and specific. She had seen this shape before, in other rooms, in other years, worn by other people. She knew what she was looking at. She stood there with the tray in her hand, and she looked at Claudette Osey, standing straight on those cold steps, with an invitation in her hand, and nothing wrong with her, except that someone had decided to make standing there her problem. Then Amara went through the side door, because she was 19, and she had a tray and a shift, and she did not know what else to do. The doing nothing settled into her chest and stayed. Travis came back after 4 minutes and 17 seconds. No list, no radio confirmation, No event coordinator behind him. Just his own face, carrying the same set of conclusions it had been carrying when he left. "I wasn't able to verify your name," he said. Claudette said. "Then I would ask you to contact the event coordinator. Her name is Helen Park. She is the Foundation's executive director. She sent me this invitation personally, and there is a handwritten note inside it from her." He looked at her. The calculation again, faster and more committed now, the kind of calculation that has already spent itself forward and does not know how to find its way back. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you to step off the steps. If you feel you have a valid invitation, you can contact. I have the invitation in my hand. I understand that. I have been standing on these steps for 4 minutes holding it." He said, "Ma'am, you're creating a disruption on the steps. I need you to step off." She looked at him for a long, even moment. Not cold, exactly. Clear. The look of someone who has absorbed a great deal over a long time and has learned, at real cost, to let the first wave pass before she decides what to do next. "You are asking me to leave," she said. "I am asking you to step off the steps." "Yes, ma'am." She looked past him, through the glass doors, into the room with the chandeliers and the ivory roses and the linen and the light. She looked at all of it for a moment. Then she looked back at him. Her expression did not change. She said, "All right." She stepped off the steps. She stood on the sidewalk. She put on her coat. She took out her phone. She was not shaking. She was not crying. She was doing the thing she had always done, the thing 22 years had made automatic and essential. She was making the next necessary call. Inside the ballroom, the evening was proceeding as designed. 300 guests in formal attire moved between tables and the open bar and the silent auction tables arranged along the western wall, where items had been donated by local businesses and a few regional celebrities, and a nationally famous chef whose restaurant had a 4-month waiting list. The room smelled of warmed canapes and expensive fragrance, and the generalized warmth of a crowd in a comfortable season of self-regard. The table linen was white. The roses were ivory. The chandeliers threw light across everything in a way that made everything look slightly better than it was. At the head table, 7 people sat in the ceremonial arrangement of a head table, elevated slightly in their own sense of significance, arranged to be seen from the room. 2 foundation board members, a city council member in a dark suit with a veteran's pin on the lapel. The same pin, the same man who had slowed on the steps and then continued inside. A retired federal judge. The foundation's vice chair, and at the far end of the table, in the gravity field that attaches to certain people in certain rooms, regardless of whether they invite it, a man in full military dress uniform, whose chest was so thoroughly covered in decorations that the fabric beneath them had become almost architectural. General Everett Dumas, United States Army, retired. 61 years old, 34 years of service. Commissioned at 23, deployed within 18 months, and from that point forward the kind of career that is not made of clean successes, but of sustained and serious work done with full attention across every condition the institution can produce. He had commanded in 2 theaters of operation. He had been decorated with Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Army Distinguished Service Medal, and a number of additional commendations that represent taken together, the record of a person who did not do this work for the decorations. He had served under 4 administrations. He had buried good soldiers. He had written the letters. He had stood at the gravesides and said the right things, and carried the weight of them forward without letting it corrode the quality of what he did. Next, he was 61 years old, and he was sitting at the head table with a glass of water he had not touched, watching the room fill, waiting for someone specific. He had read her name on the program 3 days ago and felt something he would not have described aloud, but which was in the neighborhood of the particular satisfaction of being confirmed in a belief you have held for a long time. He and Claudette Osey had served alongside each other for 4 years during a period of his career that had required everything he had. She had been his brigade commander first, and then his peer, and then in the last year before his reassignment she had been his senior. He had watched her work in conditions that were designed to reduce people to their essentials, and he had found in her more than he had found in most. Not only competence, competence was a floor in his world, not a ceiling. What he had found in her was the combination of competent and character that he had spent his career learning to distinguish from competence alone. She was, in his private accounting, one of the finest officers he had served alongside. He intended to tell her so tonight, over dinner, quietly, because that was the kind of man he was. Helen Park appeared at his shoulder at 7:23. Helen Park was the Alderton Foundation's executive director. She was 44 years old and had built the organization from a 2-person operation in a donated office to a $14 million annual enterprise through a combination of genuine commitment to the mission and a particular and precise understanding of how funding works, which is to say, she understood that money goes where relationships go, and that relationships go where trust goes, and that trust is built in small accumulations over long time by people who do what they say. She had been doing this for 11 years. She was not easily rattled. She was rattled. Her face, when she arrived at the general's shoulder, was the face of a person holding a situation in both hands and trying not to spill it. "General," she said. Her voice was careful. He looked up. "Our speaker." She paused. "Colonel Osey." Another pause. There was an incident at the door. He was still. What kind of incident? She told him. The steps, the guard, the 4 minutes, the invitation not read, the instruction to leave. He set down his water glass. Exactly. Without noise. He stood. He was 6'1" and in full dress uniforms. And when he stood up in that room, the room felt it in the way a room feels a shift in conditions, not as a sound, but as a change in the air, a change in what was possible. The conversations nearest to him softened. The people in his immediate orbit became aware of something without knowing what. "Take me to her," he said. He said it the way a person says a thing when the satyr is settled and what remains is only movement. Helen took him through the service corridor, past the catering staging area, past the server station near the kitchen entrance where Amara was restocking a tray. Amara looked up. She saw the general. She saw Helen Park's face. She understood, with the same immediate and specific clarity she had felt on the steps exactly what was happening and why. She set the tray down. She took off her service apron. She followed them. Outside, on the November sidewalk, Claudette was on the phone. She had reached Helen Park's assistant, who had already reached Helen Park, which meant that the call Claudette was making had already been answered, somewhere she could not see. She was standing straight in her coat, invitation still in her hand, phone at her ear, face showing nothing except tension. A cab passed. Two people walked by in formal wear, heading for the entrance, not glancing at her. The air was sharp and held the beginning of something cold. The amber light from the hotel turned the sidewalk a color like dull copper. She heard the door open. She turned. Everett Dumas came across the sidewalk toward her. His uniform was immaculate. His decorations moved slightly in the cold air. His face carried an expression that was not performance and not diplomacy and not the careful management of public appearance. It was the face of a man who has arrived at a moment of reckoning and is conducting himself through it with full attention and no surplus. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face. He held her gaze for a moment. 2 seconds. 3. In the way that two people who have served together look at each other when the formality of the situation meets the reality of the history. And then, deliberately, unhurried, with both hands, he reached up and removed his service hat. He held it against his chest. He said, "Colonel." She said, "General." He said, "I apologize for what happened on those steps." She said, "You weren't in the steps." He said, "No." He did not look away. "I wasn't. A beat. I should have been." The silence lasted 4 seconds. In that silence, 3 people held their breath. Helen Park, hand pressed flat against her sternum. Amara, standing in the service doorway with her arms crossed, eyes bright with something that was not yet tears, but was adjacent to them. And Travis Pelham, who had followed, the sound of footsteps and authority, to the side of the building, and was standing 15 feet away in the amber light, holding his radio against his chest with both hands, understanding. In the slow, irrevocable way that genuine reckoning happens, exactly what he had done, and exactly what he had not known, and exactly what the gap between those 2 things had cost. The general offered Claudette his arm. She looked at it. She took it. They walked to the entrance together, up the marble steps, through the tall glass doors, into the room. The room changed when they came through the door. Not stopped. Changed. Conversations at the nearest tables softened, and then the ones behind those softened, and it moved in a wave toward the center, toward the head table, toward the stage. What the room was seeing was specific. A man with 34 years of service on his chest, walking with his hat held against his heart, escorting a woman in a navy dress who walked the way people walk when they have earned, at considerable and sustained cost, the right to occupy exactly this much space in exactly this kind of room. Helen Park moved to the microphone before the scheduled program time and said simply that they were going to begin. A few minutes early, because there was someone in this room whose presence could not wait. She read the introduction she had prepared. 22 years of service. The 4th Support Brigade. 41 months in command. 10,000 soldiers. The Legion of Merit. The Defense Meritorious Service Medal. The work of the past 3 years in veteran reintegration policy. The framework changes in 2 states. The programs she had visited quietly, and the testimony she had given without fanfare, and the committee work she had done in community centers on Tuesday and Thursday evenings because it needed to be done, and she knew how to do it. Helen Park read all of it. She did not shorten a line. The room was quiet in the way a room is quiet when it is recalibrating, when it is doing the mathematics of its own earlier assumptions and arriving at uncomfortable sums. Claudette stood at the microphone, and she looked out at 300 people, and she gathered herself in the way she had always gathered herself before the hard things. Not with visible effort, not with visible anything, but with the internal act of a person who has spent decades choosing to be, in the decisive moment, precisely herself. And then she spoke. She spoke about the gap, the specific, vast, unnamed space between military service and civilian life that no one prepares you for and no one describes accurately, and that most people outside it cannot imagine from the inside. She described what it is to be a person whose purpose, identity, structure, community, and daily meaning are all organized around an institution and a mission, and then to have that removed, not taken, not seized, administratively returned. A retirement date, a ceremony with a photograph, a box, and then a silence where the mission used to be, a silence that is not peace and is not rest, but is the specific wound of purposelessness. And that wound does not get better with a thank you. It does not get better with recognition at a gala. It gets better with work, with structure, with the opportunity to be useful in a new form without having to abandon the person that 22 years of suffering made. She said, the programs this foundation funds are not charity. They are scaffolding. They are the structure inside which people who have given their foundational years can build something that is also real. And the work is not done. The work is nowhere near done. But it is being done by people in this room and by people in offices far smaller than this room who deserve every resource they can be given. She paused. She looked at the crowd. She said, the truest wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. 300 people heard it. Several people wrote it down. A woman near the back put her hand over her mouth. The city council member with the veteran's pin looked at his hands and stayed looking at them for a long time. Everett Dumas rose from his chair. He placed his hat against his chest, and he stood, and the room stood with him, and the applause went on, past the comfortable end of applause, past the polite duration, into the territory of something that was less like appreciation and more like correction. Like a room trying, in the only currency it currently had available, to make right something it had gotten wrong. Amara stood in the back corner near the service entrance where she had come to stand. With her arms crossed and her apron off, she clapped until her palms were burning. She did not stop when the rest of the room began to taper. She kept going. What followed in the 72 hours after that evening is on record. And the record is specific, because specificity is what justice requires. At 11:51 that night, Helen Park sent a formal written complaint to the Alderton Hotel's senior management. It was not a letter of general dissatisfaction. It was a document, structured and evidenced and precise. It cited the duration of the incident, 4 minutes and 17 seconds, start to finish. The failure to accept or read a presented invitation, the instruction to step aside with no stated basis, the instruction to leave the steps with no stated basis, and the complete absence of any attempt to contact the event coordinator before that instruction was given. The complaint was copied to the hotel's parent management group, the foundation's legal counsel, and all 7 members of the foundation's board of directors. At 9:03 on Sunday morning, the hotel's director of security sat down with the exterior camera footage. The footage was high resolution. The footage was continuous. It showed everything. The approach, the block, the envelope held out and not taken, the step aside, the 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the stream of other guest calls proceeding through the door without interruption. The second engagement, the instruction to leave. There was nothing in that footage that was ambiguous. There was no angle from which a reasonable person watching it arrived at a conclusion other than the one that was obvious. Travis Pelham was suspended at 9:43 in the morning. He was terminated at 2:15 in the afternoon. At 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, the Alderton Hotel's managing director issued a public statement. He wrote it himself. The statement did not use the architecture of apology that is designed to distribute responsibility until it disappears. It did not say if anyone was offended. It did not say to the extent that protocols may have been imperfectly applied. It said, this was wrong. It named Claudette Marion Osei by name. It described what happened. It apologized without qualification. It committed to a third-party review. The managing director sent the statement to Claudette directly before it went public. She read it at her kitchen table in her reading glasses. She replied with 2 sentences. She said she accepted the apology. She said she hoped the review would produce real change, and not a document describing intended change. The review produced real change. An independent consultant was retained within 4 days. The review took 29 days. The resulting report contained 8 specific reforms to the hotel's event security protocols. Reform 1. All security staff assigned to permitted private events were required to complete a verification procedure training module before deployment. Reform 2. Any guest presenting a named written invitation at a permitted event entrance was to have that invitation physically accepted, read, and cross-referenced against the event coordinator's verified list before any further action was taken. Reform 3. No guest was to be directed to step aside or leave the entrance area unless and until the on-site event coordinator had been contacted directly by radio and had confirmed, on record, that no valid invitation existed for that individual. Reform 4. An event coordinator was required to be stationed within radio range of the main entrance for the first 90 minutes of every permitted event. Reform 5. All public-facing security staff were required to complete annual bias awareness training with a specific module on confirmation bias in identity assessment. The documented cognitive tendency to form a conclusion before examining available evidence, and then to treat available evidence as irrelevant. Reforms 6, 7, and 8 addressed internal reporting, documentation of incidents, and escalation procedures for disputed entrance decisions. All 8 reforms were adopted in full. The hotel published them on its website under a section it created specifically for the purpose, titled, Our Standards for Guest Welcome. The council member, with the veteran's pin, introduced a city resolution 18 days after the gala. He had been awake at 2 in the morning on the 3rd night after the event, sitting at his kitchen table in his pajamas, and he had sat with what he had seen and what he had done, and he had arrived at the specific conclusion that is available only to people willing to stop managing their own narrative long enough to look at it directly. He had seen, he had known, he had continued inside. He could not unmake that, but he could make the next choice differently, and the next choice available to him was a resolution. The resolution proposed a city standard, a codified, enforceable protocol for the reception of invited guests and speakers at all events held on city-permitted properties. It specified that any person presenting a named invitation was entitled to have it read and verified before any other action was taken. It established that physical appearance, attire, and manner of arrival were not grounds for differential treatment in any stage of the verification process. It passed 14-3. General Dumas submitted a written statement for the record in support of the resolution. It was one paragraph. It said, among other things, she had given 22 years to this country. She had been decorated for exceptional and distinguished service. She had commanded 10,000 soldiers. None of that should have been required information for her to be welcomed into a room to which she had been invited. But since it has been made relevant, she is Colonel Claudette Marion Osey, and this city owes her more than a resolution. What the resolution can do is ensure that the next person on those steps, the person whose decorations are in a drawer at home, whose worth is not visible on the outside, is not made to stand in the cold while someone decides whether they are real. The resolution was named the OC Standard. The foundation asked Claudette to chair the advisory committee for their veteran reintegration grant cycle, not to speak, not to attend, to chair, to set the criteria, to decide where the money went and what it required of the programs it funded. She accepted because the work was real and because the money directed properly would change lives in the specific, structural, unsentimental way she believed change happened. Not from the top down and not from a stage, but from inside the work, in the daily hours before anyone is watching. Deshawn found out about the fellowship on a Thursday evening in March at 6:47 on his lunch break at the warehouse. He read the email 3 times in the break room, sitting in a plastic chair, holding his phone with both hands, completely still. He called her at 11:30. She picked up on the second ring. He said, "You circled my sentence." She said, "I know." He said, "That was the whole thing." She said, "I know." He said, "How did you know?" She said, "Because it was true. The true thing is always the whole thing. You just have to be willing to start there," he said. "I'm going to the fellowship," she said. "I know you are." Amara wrote her application essay about a November sidewalk and a woman who made the next necessary call. She wrote about the tray she set down, and what she saw and what she felt, and what she understood standing in a ballroom doorway while 300 people rose from their chairs. She wrote, "I want to spend my professional life reducing the distance between worth and recognition." She was accepted. 1 year later, the gala was held again. Same room, same chandeliers, same ivory roses, same amber light. The door was different in the way. Doors are different when the rules that govern them have been written down and trained and posted and made real. A young man at the entrance with a tablet looked up and said, "Colonel Osey, welcome back. We're glad you're here." She went inside. Everett Dumas was at the head table. He saw her come through the door. He stood. He held his hat against his chest. No crisis, no audience to witness, no one requiring it. only the quiet, certain knowledge of a man who does the right thing when nobody is watching, because that is the only time the right thing is entirely his own. She saw him across the room. She nodded. He nodded back. The evening began. The truest wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. Now stay with me, because I have been turning this story over in my mind since I first heard it, and the image I cannot put down is not the general on the sidewalk. It is not the OC standard. It is not even Amara's essay, though I think that essay is the real inheritance of this whole night. The thing that will still be growing when the rest of this has become history. The image I cannot put down is a kitchen table on a Saturday morning. A woman in reading glasses, with a cold cup of coffee and a red pen, drawing a box around a buried sentence in a student's essay and writing in the margin. This is the line. This is the whole thing. Don't bury what is true. Nobody was watching. There was no room to stand for her. There was no general. There was just a woman doing the work, in the ordinary hours, in the small, unmarked minutes that precede every public moment of recognition by years. And here is what I believe this story is actually about. We are very good at honoring people after the room has recognized them. We are practiced at standing and applauding once the general has already stood. What we are not always good at, what I am not always good at, is recognizing worth before the room has confirmed it, before the credential is on display, before the authority we recognize has told us what we're looking at. The security guard made a calculation. He made it in 2 seconds, and he made it below the level of thought, in the place where unexamined assumptions live. And most of us, if we are willing to look honestly at ourselves, make versions of that calculation. In meeting rooms, in conversations, in the quiet assessments we perform on people who have not been validated yet by anyone whose validation we recognize. We file people. We assign them a category. We treat the category as the person. So here is what I am asking you. Not the comfortable version of the question, the actual version. Think of the last time you made that calculation. Think of the specific person, the specific room, the specific moment when you decided, before asking, what someone was worth and where they belonged. Think about what that decision cost them, and think about whether you ever went back and said what Everett Dumas said on a cold sidewalk. I should have been there. I wasn't. I'm sorry. Leave one word in the comments. One word. Whatever comes up when you sit honestly with that moment. Not the word you should leave. The word that's actually there. If someone in your life needs this story, someone who has been standing on steps, waiting for a door that keeps not opening, or someone who has been walking past, share it with them tonight. Don't explain it. They will know. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do. Because about a man who cleaned the same university research laboratory for 11 years. He mopped the same floors every morning. He emptied the same bins. He heard the same conversations. The researchers walked past him with their coffee cups and their grant applications and never once asked his name. They should have asked. They really should have asked. I will see you there.